March 17, 1945, near Remagen, Western Germany. 22-year-old Wehrmacht Gefreiter Hans Mueller lay in a shell crater, clutching his shattered leg and trying not to scream. The American artillery barrage had stopped 10 minutes ago, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by distant small arms fire and the moaning of other wounded men scattered across the ravaged hillside. His left femur was broken, the bone visible through torn flesh and blood-soaked uniform. Every breath sent waves of agony through his body. Every movement threatened to make him pass out. He'd been with his unit for 18 months, retreating steadily westward as the Allied armies closed in from all sides. They'd started with 120 men. This morning, before the attack, they numbered 37. Now, looking across the smoke-filled battlefield littered with bodies in field-gray uniforms, Hans doubted more than a dozen had survived. The propaganda had told them Americans took no prisoners, that they executed wounded Germans where they lay, that surrender meant torture, humiliation, and death. His company commander, an SS Hauptsturmführer attached to oversee their defensive position, had been explicit the night before. The Americans are animals. They will shoot you if you surrender. Better to die fighting like a German soldier than beg for mercy from subhuman barbarians who show none. Hans had believed it. Why wouldn't he? It was all he'd been told since joining the Wehrmacht at 19. Americans were criminals and degenerates. Their army full of black soldiers who were barely human. Their commanders ruthless killers who violated every rule of civilized warfare. But now, lying in the crater with his leg destroyed and no weapon within reach, Hans faced the reality that he couldn't fight and couldn't retreat. He could only wait. Wait to bleed out. Wait for shock to claim him. Or wait for Americans to find him and, according to everything he'd been taught, finish him off with a bullet to the head. The sounds of boots crunching on debris made him tense. English voices, American accents. Two soldiers appeared at the crater's edge, rifles raised, scanning for threats. They saw Hans immediately. For a moment that felt like eternity. Hans and the Americans stared at each other. He was helpless, unarmed, obviously critically wounded. They were armed, victorious, in position to kill him without consequence. Everything he'd been told said they would shoot him. Everything his training had emphasized said Americans showed no mercy to wounded Germans. One of the soldiers, a corporal with a weathered face and kind eyes, lowered his rifle. "Medic!" he shouted over his shoulder. "We got a wounded German here. Real bad." Hans didn't understand the English words, but the tone wasn't hostile. It was concerned, almost gentle. The corporal knelt at the crater's edge and made eye contact with Hans. "You're gonna be okay, buddy. We're getting you help." Hans stared in disbelief as an American medic appeared moments later, sliding down into the crater without hesitation. The medic, a young man who couldn't have been older than Hans himself, immediately began assessing the leg wound, speaking in broken German. "Ich helfe dir. Keine Angst. I'm helping you. Don't be afraid." Hans's worldview, constructed over years of indoctrination and propaganda, collapsed in that crater as American hands that were supposed to kill him instead worked urgently to save his life. The medic cut away the ruined uniform, exposed the wound fully, and immediately began applying a tourniquet above the break. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his face showed concern rather than cruelty. He kept talking in that broken German, reassuring Hans that he'd be okay, that the pain would stop soon, that they'd get him to a field hospital. Another American appeared with a stretcher. Together, the medic and two soldiers carefully lifted Hans from the crater, each movement sending lightning bolts of agony through his leg. But their hands were as gentle as the situation allowed. They weren't rough. They weren't vengeful. They were professional medical personnel treating a wounded human being, regardless of which uniform he wore. As they carried him away from the battlefield, Hans saw other American soldiers treating other wounded Germans, bandaging wounds, administering morphine, loading casualties onto medical vehicles. The scene contradicted everything the propaganda had promised. Americans weren't executing prisoners. They were saving enemy lives. The medic walked alongside Hans's stretcher, monitoring his condition. At one point, he produced a canteen and held it to Hans's lips. The water was cool, clean, the most beautiful thing Hans had tasted in months. The medic smiled. "Good, yes? Gut?" Hans nodded weakly, tears forming in his eyes. Not from pain, though the agony was overwhelming, but from the cognitive dissonance of realizing that everything he'd believed was a lie. The Americans weren't monsters. They were showing more humanity toward a wounded enemy than Hans's own commanders had shown toward their own men. At the field hospital, American doctors examined Hans's leg with grave expressions. The fracture was severe, complicated by extensive soft tissue damage. In German field hospitals, which had been overwhelmed and undersupplied for months, such an injury would likely mean amputation or simply being left to die if resources were too limited. Hans had seen both outcomes in German medical facilities during the long retreat. But here, in this American field hospital set up in a commandeered German factory building, doctors discussed his case like he mattered, like saving his leg was a priority worth attempting. Through a German-speaking interpreter, one doctor explained they'd stabilize him here, then evacuate him to a rear-area hospital where surgeons could perform the complex procedure necessary to save the limb. "You will keep your leg," the interpreter translated the doctor's words. "It will be difficult, but we will save it." Hans couldn't speak. He just cried quietly as American medical personnel who had every reason to hate him worked tirelessly to preserve his future. The propaganda that killed the Nazi propaganda machine had spent years conditioning German soldiers to fear capture more than death. The messaging was systematic, pervasive, and deliberately designed to make surrender psychologically impossible. German military newspapers published fabricated stories of Allied atrocities. Radio broadcasts detailed supposed massacres of German prisoners. Officers during training sessions emphasized that Americans, particularly Black American soldiers, committed unspeakable acts against captured Germans. The racial ideology underpinning Nazi beliefs reinforced these lies. If Americans were racially inferior, culturally degenerate, and morally bankrupt, of course they would behave monstrously toward German prisoners. The propaganda served multiple purposes. It discouraged surrender, keeping soldiers fighting even in hopeless situations. It justified Germany's own war crimes by projecting them onto enemies. It maintained ideological control over soldiers who might otherwise question why they were fighting. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers genuinely believed capture meant torture and execution. Many carried cyanide capsules or saved last rounds to kill themselves rather than surrender. Others fought to the death in situations where surrender would have been militarily rational and personally survivable. Statistics documented the propaganda's deadly effectiveness. German soldiers fighting Western allies, 1944-45, approximately 7.7 million. Germans who surrendered to Western allies, approximately 7.6 million. Germans who chose death over capture, estimated 60,000 to 80,000 in final year of war. Suicide among German military personnel, 1945, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 cases. These numbers showed that while most German soldiers eventually surrendered, tens of thousands chose death specifically because propaganda had convinced them capture was worse than dying. American treatment of German POWs contradicted Nazi propaganda so completely that it created psychological crises among captured Germans. The Geneva Convention governed POW treatment, and while no system was perfect, American adherence to international law regarding prisoners was substantially better than German propaganda had prepared soldiers to expect. The contrast began immediately upon capture. German soldiers expecting execution instead received medical care, food, and basic dignity. POW camps in American-controlled territories provided adequate shelter, regular meals, medical facilities, and recreational opportunities. Germans were paid for labor according to Geneva Convention requirements. They received mail from families. They organized educational programs and sports leagues. Most surprisingly to many German POWs, they were treated as human beings rather than subhuman enemies. American guards were generally professional rather than brutal. Camp conditions, while obviously restricted and unpleasant, were incomparably better than Eastern Front conditions or German concentration camps. Hans Mueller's experience represented typical American POW treatment. After stabilization at the field hospital, he was evacuated to a larger medical facility near Frankfurt, where American surgeons spent hours reconstructing his shattered femur. The surgery was complex, involving plates and screws to stabilize the bone, careful repair of blood vessels and nerves, and meticulous closure of the extensive soft tissue damage. The surgeon, Major Robert Henderson, explained through an interpreter that Hans would need months of recovery and rehabilitation, but should eventually walk normally again. "We don't let young men lose legs if we can save them," Henderson said. "Doesn't matter which army you fought for. You're a patient now, and we take care of our patients." The recovery ward held both American and German wounded. The Americans received priority treatment, understandably, but Germans weren't neglected or deliberately given inferior care. Nurses checked on Hans regularly, changed his bandages, administered pain medication, and monitored for infection. When he developed a fever 3 days post-surgery, doctors immediately investigated, diagnosed a localized infection, and prescribed antibiotics that cleared it within a week. Hans shared his ward with 5 other German POWs and 3 American soldiers recovering from various wounds. The atmosphere was surreal. Just weeks ago, these men had been trying to kill each other. Now they shared the same room, ate the same food, and gradually began awkward attempts at communication. One American, Private First Class James Sullivan from Boston, spoke some German learned from his immigrant grandmother. Through Sullivan, Hans began conversations with his former enemies. The Americans talked about home, about families, about wanting the war to end so they could return to normal life. Their motivations weren't ideological hatred of Germany or desire for conquest. They were simply ordinary men fighting because their country had been attacked, wanting to finish the job and go home. "We don't hate you," Sullivan told Hans one evening. "We hate Hitler. We hate the Nazis. But regular German soldiers? You're just guys who got stuck in a bad situation, same as us. Nobody here wants to hurt you. We just want this damn war to end." Hans struggled to process this. His entire worldview had been constructed around German superiority and Allied barbarism. Yet here, wounded and helpless, he was receiving better medical care from Americans than he'd seen in German facilities. He was being treated with dignity by soldiers he'd been taught were subhuman. Everything he'd believed was systematically dismantled by the simple reality of American kindness. After 2 months of medical treatment, Hans was transferred to a POW camp in Bavaria, now fully under American occupation. He walked with a severe limp and required a cane, but he walked. Major Henderson had kept his promise. The leg had been saved. The camp held approximately 2,000 German POWs, a mix of Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and a few SS personnel kept in separate compounds. The facility had been a German military barracks before capture, now repurposed to house prisoners awaiting processing and eventual repatriation. Hans expected harsh conditions, perhaps not execution as propaganda had claimed, but certainly deprivation and cruelty. What he found instead was a structured environment that, while obviously restrictive, provided adequate food, shelter, medical care, and even educational and recreational opportunities. Daily ration for German POWs in American camps, 2,500–3,000 calories. Quality of food was basic military provisions, but nutritionally adequate and regularly provided. Medical care was available for illness and ongoing treatment of war injuries. Prisoners could send and receive mail under censorship protocols. Work details paid wages according to Geneva Convention requirements, typically used to purchase additional comfort items from camp stores. The camp organized German language classes for Americans learning the language and English classes for Germans wanting to learn. Sports leagues formed. Theater groups performed plays. The camp even had a small library of German books provided by relief organizations. But the most profound aspect of captivity was the ongoing cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality. German POWs discovered that Americans weren't sadistic monsters. They were professional soldiers following rules, showing basic human decency, and generally treating prisoners as the Geneva Conventions required. Hans spent hours talking with other POWs, comparing experiences. Almost all told similar stories, captured expecting execution, instead receiving medical care and basic dignity, anticipating torture, instead experiencing boredom and institutionalized monotony, typical of any POW camp, but not deliberate cruelty. Some older prisoners, veterans of World War I who'd been captured then as well, noted that American treatment in this war was substantially similar to the previous conflict. Americans followed international law, treated prisoners decently, and didn't engage in systematic abuse. The realization spread through the camp gradually but inexorably. They'd been lied to. The propaganda had been false. The Nazis had convinced them to fear capture more than death, making them fight suicidally in hopeless situations, all based on lies about how enemies treated prisoners. For Hans and thousands like him, the collapse of Nazi propaganda created profound psychological struggles. They'd built their identities around beliefs that proved false. They'd risked their lives, watched friends die, committed themselves to a cause that had systematically deceived them about the most basic realities of the war. The denazification programs implemented by American occupation authorities encouraged this reckoning. POW camps showed films of concentration camp liberations, documented Nazi atrocities, and confronted prisoners with evidence of crimes committed in Germany's name. The programs aimed to break ideological conditioning and prepare Germans for post-war democratic reconstruction. For many POWs, seeing evidence of Holocaust atrocities created additional layers of moral reckoning. They'd been told they were fighting for civilization against barbarism. Instead, they discovered they'd served a regime that committed industrialized genocide. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Hans watched films of Bergen-Belson's liberation, saw footage of emaciated corpses stacked like cordwood, heard testimony from survivors describing systematic murder. The American officer narrating the film was blunt. "This is what you fought for. This is what the Nazi regime did while telling you that you were defending civilization." Not all POWs accepted this reckoning immediately. Some rejected the evidence as Allied propaganda, clinging to Nazi ideology despite everything. But many, including Hans, couldn't deny what they were seeing. The evidence was overwhelming. The Nazi regime had committed atrocities that made American treatment of German POWs look like humanitarian kindness by comparison. "I fought for this," Hans said quietly to another POW after watching the concentration camp films. "I believed in it. I thought we were the good side. How could I have been so wrong about everything?" The other POW, a former school teacher from Munich, shook his head sadly. "Because they lied to us. From the time we were children, they lied. They told us we were superior, that our enemies were monsters, that our cause was just, and we believed them because we didn't know anything else. Now we have to live with what we did while believing those lies." German POWs held by Americans were gradually repatriated as post-war occupation stabilized. The process took months or years depending on individual circumstances, security classifications, and availability of transportation to devastated German regions. Hans was released in October 1946, 18 months after his capture. He returned to Hamburg, his hometown, which had been devastated by Allied bombing. His family home was rubble. His father had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. His mother and younger sister had survived the war but were living in a basement shelter in the ruins. The reunion was emotional and complicated. His mother cried, grateful he'd survived when so many hadn't. But Hans was changed. The young man who'd enthusiastically joined the Wehrmacht believing in German superiority and Nazi ideology had been replaced by someone profoundly disillusioned, carrying both physical and psychological scars. His leg had healed but would always pain him. He walked with a limp that marked him as a wounded veteran. More significantly, his understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered. He'd experienced American kindness firsthand, seen evidence of Nazi atrocities, and spent 18 months in captivity confronting the lies he'd believed. "The Americans saved my life," he told his mother. "Then they treated me better than our own army had treated us. Everything we were told about them was lies. Everything the Nazis told us was lies." His mother nodded sadly. She'd lost faith in the regime years earlier, but had been powerless to resist or speak openly. Now, with Germany defeated and the Nazi system destroyed, the truth could be spoken. The war had been catastrophic, the ideology had been evil, and the propaganda had been systematic deception designed to make Germans serve atrocities while believing they were defending civilization. Hans spent the rest of his life working for reconciliation and peace. He became active in German-American friendship societies, helped establish educational exchanges, and frequently spoke to young Germans about his experiences. His message was consistent: propaganda lies, nationalism kills, and humanity exists even among former enemies. In 1987, at age 64, Hans returned to the United States for the first time since the war, attending a reunion of American veterans. He met some of the soldiers who'd been involved in liberating his region, though not the specific medic who'd saved him in that shell crater in March 1945. At the reunion, he gave a brief speech, translated by an American volunteer. "I came here as your enemy. I tried to kill you. You had every right and reason to hate me. Instead, you saved my life. An American medic treated my wounds. American doctors saved my leg. American POW camps treated me with dignity I didn't deserve. You showed me that propaganda lies, that humanity transcends nationality, and that former enemies can become friends. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for showing me that compassion is stronger than hatred." The room erupted in applause. Several American veterans approached Hans afterward, shaking his hand, embracing him, sharing their own stories of the war and its aftermath. The former enemies had become friends, united by shared recognition of war's costs and peace's value. Hans Mueller's story represented a broader pattern of American treatment of German POWs that contradicted Nazi propaganda and created foundation for post-war German-American relations. German POWs held by Americans, approximately 380,000 in U.S. camps, 3.8 million in European theater camps. Death rate among German POWs in American custody, approximately 0. 15% dramatically lower than German POW death rates in Soviet custody, approximately 35–40%, or Allied POW death rates in German custody, approximately 3–5% for Western Allied prisoners, over 50% for Soviet prisoners. The low death rate among German POWs in American custody reflected Geneva Convention compliance, adequate food and medical care, and generally humane treatment. While conditions weren't luxurious and some instances of abuse occurred, systematic policy was professional treatment according to international law. This treatment had strategic implications beyond humanitarian concerns. American authorities recognized that German POWs would eventually return to Germany and become part of post-war society. Their experiences in captivity would shape their attitudes toward America and democracy. Humane treatment served both moral principles and strategic objectives. The impact was measurable in post-war Germany. Former POWs who'd been held by Americans frequently became advocates for democracy, supporters of German-American friendship, and opponents of militarism. They'd experienced firsthand the difference between Nazi propaganda and democratic reality. Many became influential in German reconstruction and democratization. The story of German soldiers surviving through American kindness was never primarily about military strategy or political ideology. It was about the fundamental choice between vengeance and humanity, between propaganda's easy hatred and the difficult work of treating enemies as human beings deserving basic dignity. The American soldiers who provided medical care to wounded Germans, who treated POWs according to Geneva Conventions, who showed kindness to former enemies, weren't following propaganda or ideology. They were making moral choices to see humanity in their opponents, to refuse to become the monsters that Nazi propaganda had claimed they were, to demonstrate that democratic civilization meant something more than military victory. The German soldiers who survived American captivity and returned home carrying memories of unexpected kindness became living bridges between former enemies. They knew from direct experience that Americans weren't barbarians, that democracy wasn't weakness, and that former enemies could become friends. This knowledge, shared across a generation of German veterans, helped establish the foundation for post-war German-American relations that transformed former enemies into close allies. For Hans Mueller, lying in that shell crater in March 1945, certain he would die either from his wounds or American execution, the American medic's hands working to save his life represented a moment of transformation. Everything he'd believed was false. Everything he'd been taught was propaganda. And the truth was so unexpected, so contrary to years of indoctrination, that it shattered his worldview and rebuilt it on different foundations. He lived another 52 years after that moment, dying in 1997 at age 74. He raised a family, built a career, worked for peace and reconciliation, and told his story to anyone who would listen. His message never changed. Propaganda lies. Humanity transcends nationality. And even in war's darkest moments, individuals who choose compassion can change lives. The American medic who saved him, whose name Hans never learned despite years of searching, was just one soldier doing his job. But that job, treating wounded enemies with the same care given to wounded friends, demonstrated that civilization survives war not through victory alone, but through maintaining humanity even when facing those who sought your death. Hans Mueller survived because American kindness proved stronger than Nazi propaganda. He lived because democratic soldiers refused to become the monsters authoritarian ideology claimed they were. And his survival, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of German POWs who experienced similar treatment, became evidence that even after total war, reconciliation remains possible when former enemies choose humanity over hatred. The shattered leg healed, though it always pained him. The psychological wounds took longer, requiring years of processing and reckoning with uncomfortable truths about what he'd believed and served. But Hans Mueller walked out of American captivity alive, whole, and profoundly changed. He walked because an American medic chose to save rather than kill, to show compassion rather than vengeance, to demonstrate that even in war, humanity could survive and transcend the propaganda of hatred. That choice made all the difference.